Coming up, now Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren want to change America in such a way that to keep some of its citizens in the country, it must erect economic barriers to prevent them from leaving. Think about that. Not only is that an incredibly bad idea because of the message it sends to those who want to invest in the country, but also it is effectively an acknowledgement that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's plans for the economy threaten to turn the country into a failed state. If that were not the case, they wouldn't have to erect barriers, in this case tax barriers, to prevent people from leaving. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Let's talk for a moment about my ideas. Typically, we talk about what's going on in the world, the latest news stories, and my reaction to them. Let's do something a little different here for this first segment. Let's imagine for a moment that I'm running for office. Let's talk about one of my ideas. The subject is taxes. There's been no shortage of tax ideas coming from the candidates for the Democratic nomination for president. Bernie Sanders in particular seems to be the most active, with a plethora of tax ideas, many of them specifically targeting billionaires, who he has tweeted should not exist in 15 years. Not the individuals themselves, but rather their status as billionaires. I'm not sure I can imagine a tax idea more certain to raise less revenue than it chases away. It literally is the antithesis of everything that made America the incredible financial success that it is. So if I wouldn't try to tax billionaires out of existence, as Bernie Sanders proposes, what would I do if I had control of America's tax policy? Well, I would recognize that the praise you hear from Republicans towards America's businesses is generally very much deserved. But the extent to which it is deserved varies dramatically, because the extent to which those businesses positively affect America and the American economy varies dramatically. And the extent to which the effect varies is generally based on the size and pay level of the American workforce employed by the business. Now, I want all businesses, but what I really want in America are those businesses that employ large numbers of people in America. A business with an enormous market capitalization, which employs very few people in the U.S., is nowhere near as valuable to our economy as one which employs large numbers of persons in the U.S. That's just a simple fact, and I suggest it's time that we recognize that simple fact in our tax policy. The tax policy that I would propose is a very substantial corporate tax, but with huge tax deductions based on the size of the corporate payroll in the U.S. As a result, the more people that the company employs and the more that the company pays them, the smaller its tax bill becomes. The result would be that a company with a U.S. headquarters and a very large, well-paid workforce in the U.S. would end up paying no corporate tax. On the other hand, a company with tremendous revenues but very few employees in the U.S. would end up paying the full rate, even if it had a headquarters in the U.S. And in the end, that would only be fair, because such a tax policy would recognize that companies which employ large numbers of Americans essentially act as a fuel pump for the American economy. Notice the difference between my tax policy and Bernie Sanders' tax policy? My tax policy is intended to incentivize actions which have a positive effect on the economy, specifically hiring a labor force in America. Bernie Sanders' tax policy is intended to penalize those who've been successful, regardless of whether that economic success has fueled economic growth in the United States. My tax policy would spur favorable economic conduct in the form of hiring U.S. labor. Bernie Sanders' tax policy would spur unfavorable economic conduct, specifically billionaires fleeing the United States or choosing to invest their money outside the U.S. or failing to take economic risks in recognition that the rewards aren't sufficient given Bernie Sanders' tax policy. And incidentally, Elizabeth Warren's tax policy is basically Bernie Sanders light, so it would have the same effect as well, perhaps not quite as drastically. And incidentally, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are both floating the idea of tax penalties for leaving the United States. Think about that for a moment. Think about the idea that a politician believes that the country can and should hold your money captive. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, one way that you could distinguish democracies with capitalist systems from the communist systems around the world was that the communist systems built fences and walls to keep their citizens in, whereas democracies with capitalist systems either had no fences and walls or built them to keep others out. When the country must erect a barrier to keep its citizens in, not only is the country effectively a prison, but it also is by definition a failed country. A successful country serves the needs of its citizens. If as a country you can't keep your citizens unless you erect barriers to prevent them from leaving, you have failed. For nearly 250 years, America has not only succeeded, it has become a resounding success. I would argue the greatest success in the history of the planet. Not only have we not erected walls to prevent citizens from leaving, but we are in the process of building walls or other barriers to prevent massive numbers of immigrants from entering illegally, because we are and have been so successful. Now, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren want to change America in such a way that to keep some of its citizens in the country, it must erect economic barriers to prevent them from leaving. Think about that. Not only is that an incredibly bad idea because of the message it sends to those who want to invest in the country, but also it is effectively an acknowledgement that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's plans for the economy threaten to turn the country into a failed state. If that weren't the case, they wouldn't have to erect barriers, in this case tax barriers, to prevent people from leaving. Next topic. Latest campus insanity. So it seems that just when you start to think that college campuses are starting to return to some level of sanity, when you see states passing college free speech laws to make sure that students can voice their opinions and that diversity of opinions will be offered on campus, some incident or professor's statement hits the news and you realize that no, insanity is still there all across the country, and we can't rely on it going away anytime soon. The latest involves the University of Mississippi, not exactly a place that you'd typically associate with far-left lunacy. In this instance, you could argue that this is an old story, but the reality is that it's new because it shows that there are few adverse consequences for over-the-line conduct and statements on the left, as opposed to what happens to those on the right. In this instance, the original over-the-line conduct or statements involved an assistant professor of sociology, James Thomas, at the University of Mississippi, who responded to the actions of various persons around the country confronting Republican officials in restaurants. In this case, just a few days after Ted Cruz was forced out of a Washington, D.C. restaurant by protesters against Brett Kavanaugh. Professor Thomas's comment on the incident, quote, "Don't just interrupt a senator's meal, y'all. Put your whole damn fingers in their salads. Take their appetizers and distribute them to the other diners. Bring boxes and take the food home with you on the way out. They don't deserve your civility." Thomas tweeted those statements on October 6, 2018. The chancellor of the University of Mississippi responded with a Facebook post, which didn't identify the professor by name, but which stated that it, quote, did not reflect the values, close quote, of the university. He also stated, but while he, quote, passionately supports free speech, close quote, he condemns, quote, statements that encourage acts of aggression, close quote. That, incidentally, is exactly what the professor's tweet encouraged. And if the professor's prior tweet wasn't enough to cause you to question his judgment, just a few months later, on January 23, 2019, he tweeted that, quote, MAGA teens, close quote, are modern-day Hitler youth. And since then, he has reiterated that he stands by the comment. Does he have the right to say that? Of course. Is the responsible thing for a professor someone who teaches youth, including teens and presumably including Trump-supporting MAGA teens? Absolutely not. Imagine for a moment that you're a teenager who supports President Trump, and you're taking a class at the University of Mississippi taught by Professor Thomas. What are the chances that you would ever publicly express in his class that you support President Trump? Unless you're willing to take the risk that he might downgrade you on assignments because of your support for the president, something he characterized as equivalent to being a member of the Hitler Youth, you would hide your support for President Trump. Now think about the irony of what that behavior mimics. It mimics the behavior of people living under a dictatorship, afraid to express their true opinions for fear of retribution from governmental authorities. The irony, of course, is that by denigrating teenage supporters of President Trump as equivalent to members of the Hitler Youth, Professor Thomas is engaging in a tactic which can have an effect on the students he's teaching which is at least similar to the effect a dictator can have on the population of his country. With that in mind, consider that since Professor Thomas's public tweets, the University of Mississippi has decided to grant him tenure. Ask yourself what a public university would have done if a conservative professor had tweeted during the Obama administration that people should stick their fingers in the salads of members of the Obama administration dining in restaurants, that they should take those Obama administration members' appetizers from them and give them to other diners, and that they should steal the food from members of the Obama administration and take it home with them. And then, what if a few months later, still during the Obama administration, that professor had referred to youthful supporters of President Obama as members of the Hitler Youth or supporters of some other murderous dictator? What do you think would have happened to that professor? I'm not asking or even talking about what should have happened to the actual professor at the University of Mississippi or the fictional conservative professor I just described. I'm simply asking whether any of us really believe that these two professors, one who exists in real life and one who is fictional, would ever have been treated in a consistent manner. I think we all suspect and perhaps know that the professor expressing the over-the-top liberal views is more likely to be treated leniently and given the benefit of the doubt, whereas the conservative professor is more likely to have been punished, which might include a refusal to grant tenure. Bottom line is that we know that these two professors would not be treated equally, and it shouldn't be that way. The recognition is just one tiny piece of the disassembled puzzle which our society has become. Whether we'll be able to reassemble that puzzle in a way that makes sense and where the rules are followed is open to question. By the way, there's a postscript to this story. The professor in question was recently elected to the Chancellor's Academic Freedom and Faculty Responsibility Committee. Check out campusreform.org for more details. Next topic. Joker's Wild. For those of you who've listened to many of the earlier episodes of this podcast, you know that I love films. I've been a supporter of the movie since I was a kid, and several episodes of this podcast include movie reviews, often from a political or social perspective. As I've said before, many movies over the years have spoken to me personally. I've been able to identify characters and circumstances which I've encountered in my life, and the best movies have helped provide an exciting and engrossing escape for at least a couple of hours. If you've been following reviews of the movie Joker, you know that they've been all over the map and that they changed significantly from the initial pre-release reviews. One of the most commonly repeated terms to describe the movie in the pre-release reviews was masterpiece. But that certainly hasn't been the case with more recent reviews. They've been considerably more negative. Some have criticized the movie for depicting the lead character in a light which was too sympathetic. Some have criticized the film for being crafted in such a way that it could be used by extremists on either end of the political spectrum as a sort of manifesto. Some have criticized it as being written in such a way that antisocial extremist incels could be motivated to violence in reaction to the film. As the reviews of the film started to change, some comments from the director, Todd Phillips, were released which were critical of what has come to be called cancel culture, the tendency to get people fired or ostracized from society if they expressed views contrary to the politically correct left-wing perspective. Phillips used to write and direct comedies, most notably the Hangover trilogy, Old School, and Starsky and Hutch. Phillips is quoted in a Vanity Fair interview as saying that it's difficult, quote, to be funny nowadays with this woke culture, close quote. That, quote, funny guys, close quote, are too fearful of offending anyone, and that, quote, it's hard to argue with 30 million people on Twitter, close quote. Those comments were reported on in the New York Post on October 3 in an article entitled Joker Director's Cancel Culture Regrets, Another Commentary. Some commentators from the right have watched the tone of the reviews for the film change and have speculated that the change is the result of movie reviewers from the left objecting to the director's comments regarding woke culture. In the view of some of those commentators from the right, the movie is clearly mocking the views of the left as to the problems of our society. So what do I think? Well, let's talk for a minute about my view of the film. I appreciate the technical aspects of film. I appreciate great cinematography. I appreciate great writing. Even in films that I didn't particularly enjoy, Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri being an example of one which I reviewed or commented on in this podcast, I made sure to compliment the writing, which in the case of that film for about a 30-minute segment of the movie was some of the best I've ever seen. But I find that when you end up picking out particular technical aspects of movies and focusing on them rather than the big picture, it's usually an indication that the film as a whole wasn't that enjoyable. I love movies and I see a lot of them, and unlike most people, I typically see them in the theater. I'll pay the money. I'll take out that home equity loan to get a large popcorn and a large Diet Coke. I rarely say I'll wait for it to come out on pay-per-view or Netflix or Amazon Prime. But I'm not and have never been part of the film industry. I didn't major in film. I'm looking to be immersed in the film and to enjoy it. It doesn't have to be a happy film, but in some instances realism can be taken too far. I remember when I went to see the movie Les Miserables. I didn't particularly like the movie, but I had one particular and nitpicky problem with some of the early scenes. Now, Hugh Jackman was portraying Jean Valjean, who was held prisoner for 19 years. It's hard to imagine Hugh Jackman looking emaciated or decrepit. He is, after all, Wolverine. So what was one of the things they did to make him look bad? Well, they gave him a set of the yellowest teeth I think I've ever seen. He looked like he just finished eating a sub sandwich made entirely of mustard, cheese, and Fritos, and followed it up with a 5-gallon bucket of banana pudding. I was sitting closer to the screen than usual that day, so I'm trying to watch the film, and all I'm doing is staring at what look like 10-foot-tall yellow teeth. You can take realism a bit too far. I remember afterwards my assistant asked me what I thought of the film, and I told her I didn't enjoy it, and I made the mistake of telling her about Hugh Jackman's yellow teeth. She's never forgiven me for it. She went to the movie and generally enjoyed it, but she couldn't stand the scene with Hugh Jackman's teeth because she couldn't stop staring at them. And she says if I hadn't told her about it, she never would have noticed. Oh well. Speaking of which, I probably should have said spoiler alert, but Les Miserables' been out for 7 years already. So enough with Les Miserables. What did I actually think of Joker? I'll be blunt. You can take an extremely capable actor and put him or her in the performance of their lives, but that doesn't alone make a movie a good one. A couple of years ago, I saw the movie Darkest Hour, where Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill put in a performance that was so amazing that it could be described as an out-of-body experience for him. And that was a great movie, one of my favorites in the last several years. Joaquin Phoenix's performance in Joker is similarly over the top. It was a fantastic achievement for an actor, but the movie itself isn't good. I didn't enjoy it. Perhaps his performance was too gritty, too realistic? In some respects, maybe. The bottom line is I actually felt trapped in the theater. Nothing about it was enjoyable. I was watching a performance that I recognized was extremely skilled acting, but the story and the setting was so depressing, almost disgusting, not just for individual segments, but for nearly the entire film, that I simply couldn't enjoy it. I described it to my friends as being like staring at an open wound for 2 hours. I saw one commentator online, I can't remember who it was, describe watching the movie as like being trapped in a spinning cement truck full of vomit. A pretty disgusting description of a movie that I found pretty disgusting. Now I'll make one exception to my comments. If you're a serious fan of comic books and have a great deal of curiosity and interest in how the film will change the arc of the Batman franchise, then that probably puts you among a group of people that will enjoy the film. Personally, I didn't care enough about the changing arc of the Batman franchise to stare at an open wound for 2 hours, but if you're so inclined, have at it. I hope you're inclined to continue listening to Political Spirits, even if you disagree with my review of Joker. I'll be back next week with another episode, probably with a focus back entirely on politics. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.